Complaints about high service fees, costs hardly justify Ethiopia's obsession with acquiring a port it controls. Ethiopia can foster competition among regional ports to obtain optimal port service fees. More importantly, obtaining a port that it controls is not likely to change its costs significantly, as already noted. The claim that Ethiopia is at risk because it is overly dependent on its coastal neighbors is also unconvincing, as it conflates dependence with interdependence and complementarity. Ethiopia's trade is, for example, a critical driver for Djibouti's economy, contributing significantly through port service fees and imports, including essential resources like water. Similarly, Eritrea's ports benefited from Ethiopian trade until the 1998 border war prompted Ethiopia to boycott them. In this context, Ethiopia's relationships with its coastal neighbors are better understood as mutual and complementary rather than one-sided dependence. A parallel narrative has emerged among Prime Minister Abiy's supporters, asserting that Eritrea's port of Assab should belong to Ethiopia, arguing that Ethiopia has a legal entitlement. For example, in a 2018 paper, Yacob Haile Mariam criticized the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, EEBC, established by the Algiers Agreement of 2000, for not addressing Ethiopia's right of access to the sea through Assab, even though Ethiopia's government at the time recognized Eritrean sovereignty over the port based on colonial boundaries and in line with the 1964 principle of the Organization of African Unity, now African Union, that colonial boundaries are sacrosanct. The EEBC was also charged with demarcating the boundary on the basis of the colonial boundaries, which the two countries agreed on. The narrative of Assab belongs to us is currently booming in Ethiopia's social media, and Eritrean social media is reacting in equal measure, heating up the conflict temperature. 3.1 Economic and security implications. The Prime Minister's rhetoric of an existential threat risks undermining regional stability. This posture has already fueled an arms race and spurred the formation of defensive alliances among neighboring countries, further straining relations in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia's internal civil wars, coupled with Eritrea's protracted and arduous liberation struggle against Ethiopian hegemony, are stark reminders that disputes over ports must not be allowed to foster perpetual conflict and destruction. Chapter 3 emphasized that Ethiopia's right of access to the sea is best resolved through a bilateral agreement between landlocked Ethiopia and transit Eritrea in accordance with the law of the sea. In an increasingly interconnected world, the imperative lies in fostering bilateral and multilateral partnerships built on symbiotic relationships, economic integration, and complementarity. These approaches are essential to constructing the foundational infrastructure for regional development and ensuring sustainable progress for all nations in the Horn of Africa. 4.0 Motivations behind Prime Minister Abiy's rhetoric. Prime Minister Abiy seems to have several objectives in portraying Ethiopia's lack of access to the sea as an existential threat. Chief among them is, diverting attention from internal challenges, such as the ongoing conflicts with the Fano rebellion in the state of Amhara and the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, elements in the state of Oromia, and the state of influx in Tigray. Controlling a port raises a nationalist fervor in the country, and Abiy may have aimed to weaken opposition forces by shifting public support away from them. Another motive might be the Prime Minister's ambition to position Ethiopia as a great power with a strong navy, as implied in his parliamentary speech referencing Ethiopia's historical maritime strength. Making Ethiopia a great power will, however, require addressing the country's nation-building crisis first. When Prime Minister Abiy signed a Memorandum of Agreement, MOU, with Somaliland, an autonomous region within Somalia, for the latter to give Ethiopia a coastal strip in exchange for its recognition of Somaliland's independence, he appeared to have achieved his goal. However, with Somalia's strong objections, and improved relations with Somalia with Turkey's mediation, the MOU has stalled. Based on the emerging rhetoric in Ethiopia, Abiy's target appears to have shifted to the Eritrean port of Assab. Regardless of his objectives or target, the Prime Minister's claim that Ethiopia faces existential threat due to its lack of access to the sea is highly exaggerated. Ethiopia has never been denied access to regional ports, and its current challenges, governance failures, ethnic fragmentation, and chronic conflicts pose far greater threats to its stability. Addressing such critical problems is far more important in enhancing its economy and security than building a navy. Good neighborly relations with coastal countries would be more effective in fostering regional stability and addressing Ethiopia's short and long-term trade and security concerns. The notion of an existential threat is, thus, a populist narrative that may lead the region to perpetual conflicts it can hardly afford. A focus on fostering interdependence, economic integration, and regional cooperation, rather than aggressive unilateral approaches, would better serve Ethiopia's interests and contribute to the stability of the Horn of Africa. 4.1 Implications of Ethiopia's control of coastland on coastal countries. Not surprisingly, the coastal nations of Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia reacted negatively to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's parliamentary speech demanding control of a coastline. Somaliland, however, signed a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, with Ethiopia to lease a 20-kilometer coastline in exchange for Ethiopian recognition of Somaliland's independence. As already noted, that MOU has now stalled, and its fate remains unclear. If Ethiopia secures sea access, the economic and security dynamics of the region will likely shift, at least in the short and intermediate terms. Djibouti could suffer significant revenue losses if Ethiopia redirects its trade through a port that is under its control. For instance, if Ethiopia's new port supplants Djibouti's as a primary trade hub, Djibouti's revenue from port fees would decline. In the long run, with economic development, the region might need more ports than it currently does, and Djibouti's port earnings might stabilize. Djibouti may be able to lease a coastal strip to Ethiopia, however, the revenue it gets from lease fee and other charges compensate the loss of revenue from the port services it currently collects from Ethiopia. Under such conditions, however, Ethiopia's gains from leasing a port might be undermined. Eritrea would bear no economic losses from Ethiopia acquiring a port elsewhere, as Eritrean ports are not currently in use by Ethiopia. Given their decades-long hostilities, Eritrea will unlikely allow Ethiopia to establish a naval base on its territory, as that would pose significant security risks. Ethiopia's rhetoric about claiming Assab further strains relations, complicating potential reconciliation. Eritrea might obtain some economic benefits by leasing a coastal strip to Ethiopia to build a port. The benefits would be from activities, such as fees levied for road charges, lodging, and meals for drivers and transit agents, and from the lease of the coastal strip. An agreement is, however, unlikely under the prevailing hostile environment. Somaliland could offer a workable solution for Ethiopia's sea outlet problem if the Republic of Somalia's sovereignty concerns are resolved. However, as noted above, this would increase competition for Djibouti, which could lose significant trade revenue. Additionally, Somaliland's ports may be too distant to effectively serve Ethiopia's northern regions, which might still rely on ports in Djibouti, or Eritrea if relations improve. For Ethiopia, acquiring sea access may not yield immediate economic benefits. Establishing a naval base, building a port, and paying various charges including lease fees, would be as costly as the current port service fees, especially given Ethiopia's growing debt burden. A naval base, particularly, is a non-revenue generating asset. In the long run, a sea access could become strategically valuable, but the current ambiguous approach jeopardizes peaceful negotiations. Ethiopia's pursuit of sea access, while strategically important, is fraught with economic, political, and security risks for both Ethiopia and the littoral countries in the region. Achieving this objective peacefully and sustainably will require transparency, collaboration, and careful negotiation. Prioritizing regional cooperation over unilateral action offers a far better path toward fostering sustainable peace and economic integration, ultimately ensuring mutual benefits for all parties involved. 5.0 Accommodating the interests of all parties. As intimated already, Ethiopia's demand for access to a coastline has predominantly met resistance from its neighboring coastal countries, except for Somaliland, a non-sovereign territory, which is unable to fulfill this demand legally. Initial reaction from the coastal countries of Eritrea, Somalia, and Djibouti were negative due to security concerns and economic implications. Given their long-standing conflicts with Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia are particularly concerned about the potential threat posed by an Ethiopian naval base on their territories. Djibouti, by contrast, is more concerned about the implications to its economy. Given these challenges, the countries of the region would need to explore alternative approaches that satisfy the economic well-being and other interests of all parties while building trust and regional peace. Longer-term approaches should be explored, including bilateral, regional, or combined strategies. 5.1. Bilateral approaches. The bilateral relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia, for example, will first require a formal agreement on how to meet Ethiopia's right of access to the Red Sea without jeopardizing Eritrea's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The bilateral relations may also include restoring aspects of the pre-border war economic cooperation and integration between the two countries. That short-lived cooperation agreement enabled Ethiopia to access the ports of Assab and Massawa under mutually beneficial terms, diversifying its port options and securing competitive port service fees. Doing so will also enable the two countries to conduct their trade, including Ethiopia's port-related services, with payments in local currencies, reducing the need for hard currency. Eritrea can also pay for its imports from Ethiopia, including possibly electricity, in birr or nakfa, again reducing the need for scarce hard currency. Finally, it will provide Ethiopia the opportunity to invest in the development of ports, such as Assab and Massawa, to lower operational costs. Developing such bilateral economic ties among the region's countries is likely to create conditions for developing close political and security relations. Such initiatives, along with avoiding unilateral declarations on matters that affect their neighbors, would also help the countries of the region to build trust, strengthen political and economic ties, and facilitate effective regional integration. 5.2. Regional integration approaches. Institutional approach. Rebuilding a functional and inclusive regional integration framework is equally critical. The Intergovernmental Authority for Development's, IGAD, current ineffectiveness, driven by frequent disputes among member states, has stalled progress. A reformed IGAD that relies on institutions and includes civil society stakeholders could, 1. Enhance economic development. Effective integration fosters economic growth by enhancing collaboration in several areas, including sharing of resources throughout the region through free trade and free flow of investments. Given the small size of most of the countries of the region, effective integration would enable them to benefit from economies of scale and specialization. Regional integration can also help member countries to develop complementarity among their economies. Further, effective integration is likely to enhance the region's bargaining power against non-regional trading partners. Table 3 ranks the countries of the Greater Horn based on integration level of their trade, infrastructure, and macroeconomics. It shows that Uganda, Kenya, Djibouti, and Ethiopia are the more integrated economies of the region. The same four countries are also the ones that have registered relatively better performance on their GDP per capita, depicted earlier in Table 1. 2. Establish collective security. A stable integration would also restrain member states from taking unilateral measures that threaten broad collective interests and security of member countries, and instead, encourage them to engage in advancing collective security and shared interests. Ethiopia stands to benefit more from bilateral and integrated regional approaches than from a unilateral strategy focused solely on its own interests, which may harm some of its neighbors. A strengthened IGAD that promotes regional integration is, thus, essential for promoting sustainable economic development and long-term peace in the region. Table 3, IGAD Regional Integration, 5 dimensions of regional integration and performance of its members. Scores are calculated on a scale of 0, not at all integrated, to 1, entirely integrated. S/N1234567 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Sudan, Eritrea. Average trade integration, infrastructural integration, productive integration 0.74, 0.61, 0.92, 0.57, 1.00, 0.81, 0.55, 0.72, 0.21, 0.48, 0.54, 0.04, 0.30, 0.28, 0.1, 0.20, 0.58, 0.11, 0.35, 0.04, 0.15, 0.32, 0.16, 0.17, 0.44, 0.48, 0.32. Free movement macroeconomic integration 0.77, 0.39, 0.65, 0.38, 1.00, 0.31, 0.06, 0.85, 1.00, 0.35, 0.30, 0.55, 0.42, 0.31, 0.12, 0.25, 0.54, 0.42. Source: IGAD. https://www.integrateafrica.org/ranking/regional economic communities/IGAD/6.0. Conclusion: our analysis does not show that Ethiopia faces existential threat from being landlocked. While it may benefit from having its own seaport, its absence does not pose an existential threat, as contended by its prime minister. Unlike many landlocked countries, Ethiopia enjoys relatively short distances to its coastal neighbors' ports, which helps to keep transit costs relatively low. Its littoral neighbors have also never denied it access to their ports, as they recognize its right of access to the sea, and since doing so would be against their own interests. Not having a naval base has also not caused any known security threat to its maritime trade. Presently, Ethiopia faces a greater security threat from internal forces than external forces. It is also likely that one of its neighbors would lease it a coastal strip for a naval base, provided that an Ethiopian navy in its territory does threaten its security and the lease fees are attractive. Given its internal challenges, Ethiopia's aspirations to become a significant power may be a long-term project. In the short term, it faces more significant hurdles than lack of control of a seacoast. Its ongoing nation-building crisis, chief among the obstacles perpetuating chronic internal conflicts that threaten the country's unity and integrity. Addressing such foundational problems is crucial for Ethiopia to realize its big power ambitions. Good regional relations can help Ethiopia with its nation-building crisis, while poor regional relations can complicate its nation-building efforts. Summary and conclusion. Gabra Hiwet Tesfaji Orgis. Our review of the ancient history, including the Aksumite Kingdom era, of Eritrea and the surrounding areas, revealed that the diverse communities inhabiting the area share a proud common heritage. Such a common heritage needs to be channeled towards economic cooperation and peaceful coexistence rather than being used to claim territories of neighboring states. Continuing to the modern history, we described how colonial Italy established Eritrea as its colony in 1890, following a series of treaties with local Afar sultanates. The Italian colonial rule, lasting over 60 years, unified the diverse ethnic groups, recognized as 9 nationalities, in a common struggle against the colonial rule, leading to the emergence of Eritrean nationalism. The latter was reinvigorated during the British military administration, BMA, following Italy's defeat in 1941, and became full-blown during the federation with and eventual annexation by Ethiopia. An arduous armed struggle led to the independence of Eritrea, de facto in 1991 and de jure in 1993, following a referendum. Thus, Eritrea joined the world community as an independent sovereign state on May 28, 1993. The current internationally defined and recognized boundaries between Eritrea and Ethiopia are colonially established, as is true of most modern African countries. In this case, an outcome of a series of treaties concluded between Italy, the colonizer of Eritrea, and Ethiopia's Emperor Menelik in the early 1990s. The Algiers Agreement in 2000, following a border conflict between the two countries, confirmed the colonially established borders between the two countries, only to be threatened with the resurfacing of Prime Minister Abiy's belligerent quest for owning a Red Sea coastal property. In addressing the two interlinked issues of geography and demography, that are part of the main arguments Ethiopia uses to support its demand for ownership of and access to the Red Sea, we explored the role of physical geography and key periods in history defining the evolution of socio-economic isolation between and within countries in the Horn of Africa. Countries in the Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia, are not only socio-politically isolated from each other, but also have marked isolation within. Ethiopian elites' geographic and demographic arguments oversimplify the social and economic problems at hand. Overcoming the significant spatial difference lies more in institutional restructuring than in acquiring access to the sea. The current Ethiopian expansionist rhetoric, sometimes advocating forceful ownership of a sea outlet, only compounds mistrust among states and reinforces the existing isolation. Regarding the ethnic argument, centered on the ethnic Afar, we have shown that the Afar are an integral part of the Eritrean state who played a critical role in the anti-colonial as well as the struggle for Eritrea's self-determination and independence, commencing in the 1940s, and throughout the armed struggle phase. The argument by Ethiopians that the majority of ethnic Afar reside in Ethiopia, and therefore, the Afar lands straddling Eritrea and Djibouti should belong to Ethiopia, violates the territorial integrity of the independent states of Eritrea and Djibouti and goes contrary to the policy of inviolability of colonially established boundaries and international norms. Posing the question, does international law provide Ethiopia the right of access to the sea? We answered in the affirmative. Article 125, 1, of the UN Law of the Sea provides landlocked states like Ethiopia the right of access to and from the sea. However, this right is not absolute. Sections 2 and 3 of the same article make it clear that the landlocked state's right is contingent on an agreement with the transit state and requires respecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Eritrea, and the other littoral states in the Horn region of Africa, recognize Ethiopia's right of access to the sea. The problem arises when Ethiopia demands ownership of a coastal territory, like the port of Assab. Unfortunately, Ethiopian leaders are obsessed with ownership in their quest for sea access. Ethiopia'S, in a recent essay, aptly titled, "The Ghosts of the Ethiopian Empire Continue to Haunt the Horn," describes Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy's aggressive impulse against its neighbors, as a continuation of an imperial legacy that still lingers in the collective consciousness of the Ethiopian state and the elites that sustain it. It needs to be emphasized that any claim of ownership of the Red Sea coast portion of Eritrea, be it the port of Assab or otherwise, in the manner articulated by Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, or in any other threatening way, is a direct affront to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Eritrea. It is a violation of two important and very relevant international laws, the 1964 African Ethiopia'S, that declared sovereignty and inviolability of colonially inherited boundaries, and Article 4 of the Union Charter that prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The contention that being landlocked is an existential threat to Ethiopia, as claimed by its prime minister, is an exaggeration. The respectably high economic growth experienced by the country, under Ethiopia'S in the late 1990s and early 2000s, is a standing testimony to the possibility of economic success while being landlocked. The major problems lie elsewhere. Ethiopia faces more significant hurdles than lack of sea access. Chief among them is its ongoing nation-building crisis, perpetuating chronic internal conflicts threatening the country's unity and integrity. Addressing such foundational problems is a crucial requisite for Ethiopia to realize its developmental goals. Healthy regional relations can be helpful in her nation-building effort, while poor regional relations, such as pushing to own a coastal territory, can complicate its nation-building effort. Ethiopia's coastal neighbors have never denied it access to their ports, as they recognize its right of access to the sea, and since doing so would be against their own interests. Unlike many landlocked countries in Africa, Ethiopia enjoys relatively short distances to its coastal neighbors' ports, which helps keep transit costs relatively low. Given these challenges, Ethiopia and the other countries in the region need to explore peaceful bilateral and/or multilateral negotiations, provide Ethiopia access to the sea, satisfy the interests of all parties, and build trust among them. For example, a peacefully negotiated bilateral agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, in accordance with the provisions of the Law of the Sea, that grants landlocked Ethiopia access to the sea without jeopardizing transit Eritrea's sovereignty, would enable 1. Ethiopia to have access to the Eritrean ports of Asab and Massawa under mutually benefiting terms, 2. Both countries to rebuild economic cooperation, trade in local currencies to minimize the need for hard currency, and even 2. Eventual integration of their economies, 3. Ethiopia to invest in the development of the ports of access and related infrastructural requirements, and 4. Eritrea to reactivate and enhance the economic activities of its ports and gain economic benefits, while avoiding the constant sea access-related threats from Ethiopia. Exploring a functional and inclusive regional integration is also important. Despite its current ineffectiveness, due to frequent disputes among its member states, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, a regional organization, can provide the framework for such a regional integration. A functional regional integration would 1. Enhance interstate collaboration and foster economic growth, and 2. Prevent unilateral adverse measures of member states. Ethiopia benefits from such a regional integration, as that can provide her with a framework for gaining access to the sea in the most economical and effective way. Several recommendations are implied in the foregoing discussion with which we would like to conclude this project. Following are the significant ones. 1. Ethiopians need to reconcile with Eritrea's independence and sovereignty. Ethiopians should accept and respect Eritrea's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. For the last 30-some years, Eritrea has been an internationally recognized sovereign state, including by Ethiopia itself, covering its colonially defined territory, which includes the coastal areas of the Red Sea including the ports of Asab and Massawa. 2. Coastal states should accept Ethiopia's legal right of access to the sea. Eritrea and the other coastal states of the Horn of Africa should recognize and accept Ethiopia's legitimate legal right of access to the sea and transit. Ethiopia, on its part, should focus on this right and cease its quest for ownership of any piece of Eritrea's territory, be it Asab or otherwise. 3. Eritrea and Ethiopia should negotiate for a bilateral agreement. The two states should formally negotiate in good faith for a bilateral agreement that provides Ethiopia free access to the Red Sea and freedom of transit of its goods in a way that does not infringe on Eritrea's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as provided for in Article 125 of the United Nations Law of the Sea. It is hard to speculate the specifics of such an agreement. It depends on the negotiating position and strength of the parties. However, it should be noted that Eritrea should be mindful of the fact that Ethiopia has alternative sea outlets in the other transit states of the area. On the other hand, Ethiopia should be mindful of Eritrea's legitimate sovereignty and security rights and concerns. 4. Area states should explore possibilities for negotiating multilateral agreements. Doing so will lead to the establishment of a regional integration which can provide the framework for not only granting landlocked Ethiopia access to the sea, but also for economic cooperation, development, and peace and security of the region. Reforming the currently weakened Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, will be a good place to start. 5. Ethiopia should cease playing the ethnic Afar card. Ethiopia should cease insisting that the Eritrean ethnic Afar and their territory should belong to Ethiopia, where she claims the majority Afar reside. Any attempt at dislodging a community or territory from a neighboring coastal state in the name of ethnic unity goes contrary to the policy of Ethiopia'S and is thus, a breach of international law. 6. Ethiopia should also cease any military or belligerent posture. Ethiopia should cease its military, or other belligerent postures and threats in her quest for gaining access to the sea. Such approaches create a hostile atmosphere that hinders the pursuit of peaceful bilateral and/or multilateral negotiation. These recommendations call for the abandonment of hostile approaches to settling differences. Instead, they emphasize peaceful negotiations and cooperation among states, bilaterally and/or multilaterally. If implemented, they can promote peace, stability, and development not only between Eritrea and Ethiopia, but in the whole Horn of Africa region. Short bios of members of the task force and contributors, listed in the order of their appearance in the report. Johannes Haile, Ph.D., is a regulatory scientist in Health Canada, an adjunct professor in the Department of Neuroscience, Carleton University. He assesses biologics-derived therapies including cell and gene therapies. He leads Science and Regulatory Preparedness Working Group, represents Health Canada in the Canadian Standards Association in a capacity of member of Subcommittee on Lymphohematopoietic Cell Standards. Johannes received several prestigious awards including the 2021 Health Canada Awards of Excellence. He previously served as research scientist at the University of Alberta, sessional lecturer at the King's University in Canada, and biologist in CDC, Ministry of Health Eritrea. Johannes earned his PhD in neuroscience and his Master of Science in molecular microbiology and aquatic ecology. Gebrhiwet Tesfagiorgis earned his PhD and JD degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He held senior administrative positions at the University of Wisconsin and University of Nebraska. He was Director of Institutional Research when he retired from Iowa State University in 2016. He now resides in Madison, Wisconsin, USA. He was a member of the Constitutional Commission of Eritrea. His scholarship interest is in Eritrea and the Horn region of Africa. He has written, and edited, several publications on Eritrea. He was executive editor of the Eritrean Studies Review, Journal of the Eritrean Studies Association. Mohammed Kir Omer, Ph.D., at Ngairam, a writer and researcher based in Norway, specializes in African political issues, focusing on the Horn of Africa. He previously served as the Dean of the College of Agriculture and Aquatic Sciences at the University of Asmara, Eritrea. He has authored two notable books, The Dynamics of an Unfinished African Dream, Eritrea Ancient Times to 1968 and Asmara 1890 to 1941 Compared to Modern Times, A Virtual Exploration. His analytical writings on the Horn and the Sahel regions have appeared in magazines such as Foreign Policy, African Arguments, Democracy in Africa, Pan-African Review, and GISCA. He curates a digital archive dedicated to Eritrea and the Horn region at https://hedge8.blogspot.com/. Mibrato Atuberhan, Ph.D., is a marine scientist with expertise in marine ecology, climate change impacts, and coastal ecosystem resilience, particularly in the western Indian Ocean region. His research focuses on climate change-induced coral bleaching, biodiversity conservation, and the integration of community livelihoods with sustainable resource management. He served as a lecturer at the University of Asmara and held research fellowships at the University of Warwick, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and Blue Ventures Conservation. His early work focused on the seasonal dynamics of marine ecosystems in the southern Red Sea, Eritrea. Currently, he is an independent environmental researcher. He has contributed to global initiatives like the United Nations Environment Programme. Paulos T. Beitai, Master of Laws, is a lawyer by training with extensive professional experience spanning humanitarian relief work, university lecturing, constitution building, conflict resolution, and advocacy for peace, democracy, and human rights. He led the Eritrean Relief Association, ERA, that mobilized international support for drought and war victim Eritreans during the independence struggle, 1976 to 1990. In post-independence Eritrea, he played a leading role in the making of the 1997 Eritrean Constitution. Paulos served as Senior Legal Officer of the United Nations Mission for Iraq, UNAMI, an advisor in the South Sudanese Constitution review process, Senior Advisor to IGAD's Special Envoy for Peace in South Sudan. He quietly contributed for peace initiatives following 1998 to 2000 Ethio-Eritrea War. Team Tawald Birhan holds 2 Master of Science degrees from the London School of Economics, LSE1 in Information Systems Analysis, 1983, and another in International Law of the Sea and Marine Policy, 1990. Anticipating Eritrea's imminent independence and the challenges of a landlocked Ethiopia, he wrote a paper for EPLF titled, Access to and from the Sea and Transit Rights for Landlocked States, The Case of Ethiopia, 1990. Following Eritrea's independence in 1991, Team served as Director of European Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a member of the Eritrea-Yemen Maritime Dispute Commission, 1995 to 1996. He coordinated development programs and proposed a virtual National Strategic Research Institute until his resignation in late 1997. Kadain Mengisteeb, Ph.D., is Professor of African Studies and Political Science at the Pennsylvania State University. The focus of his research includes security in the Greater Horn of Africa, relevance of traditional institutions to Africa's governance, socio-economic implications of extractive industries in Africa, and new approaches to democratization in Africa. Among his books are The Horn of Africa, Hotspots in Global Politics, Polity Press, 2015, and an edited volume titled The Crisis of Democratization in the Greater Horn of Africa, James Curry, 2020. He is currently finishing up a book titled Africa's Traditional Institutions of Governance, Promise and Problems. Sengal Woldetensi is a scholar and practitioner in economic development with specialization in public policy development and implementation. In post-independence Eritrea, he served as Director of Industrial Development and Promotion in the Ministry of Trade, Tourism, and Industry, 1991 to 2003, and Director of Water Resources Management and Use in the Ministry of Land, Water and Environment, 2004 to 2012. He contributed to the drafting the first Eritrean macro policy in 1994, and was a member of the delegation that negotiated the economic and trade agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, 1993 and 1995. Sengal has represented the Eritrean government at COMESA, Alliances for Africa's Industrialization, and the Third UN Conference on Least Developed Countries. Mengisteeb Tesfayehan's, B. Ph.D., is an accomplished professor, researcher, and business and economic development consultant with more than 30 years of experience. His expertise extends across reputable academic institutions in Europe, Africa, and North America. He has lent his services to governmental bodies, private organizations, and international agencies, notably the United Nations, UN, UN Development Programme, UNDP, UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNICA, Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GTZ, and the UN Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. His professional engagements cover several countries, including the United States, Canada, South Africa, Botswana, Germany, Austria, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. He is the recipient of the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellowship.